How could a monk become the weary force guiding kings and crusaders, carrying sorrows deeper than the victories he inspired? Welcome, dear friends, wherever you're listening tonight. May this quiet moment gather us together in peace as you subscribe and join our gentle journey into a saint's life now. This is the story of Bernard of Clairvaux, a brilliant soul drawn from the silence of the cloister into the burdens of guiding nations, discovering along the way how grace transforms exhaustion, sorrow, and sacrifice into a deeper, enduring holiness. As the question lingers in the air like a soft echo, we return to the earliest whispers of Bernard's story, to the quiet fields and gentle hills of Burgundy, where a child once opened his eyes to a world that felt at once beautiful and strangely insufficient for the depths stirring within him. He was born in 1090 near Dijon, into a noble family whose lands were broad and whose expectations were even broader. Yet from the beginning, Bernard carried a sensitivity that set him apart, a delicacy of mind and soul that drew him toward silence more than celebration, toward prayer more than pageantry. His mother, the devout and gentle Aleph, watched him with a kind of quiet understanding, sensing that this third son, with his luminous eyes and contemplative stillness, was marked for something beyond the family's ambitions. In the glow of her affection, Bernard learned his first lessons in tenderness, in trust, and in the mysterious language of faith that would one day pulse through his writings and shape the monasteries of Europe. His father, a knight named Tessalin, carried the stern dignity of a soldier but treated his children with warmth, never imagining how profoundly his son's path would diverge from the future he imagined for him. Yet even within a home filled with honor and comfort, Bernard often felt an ache he could not name. He studied with zeal, absorbing scripture, the poetry of the Psalms, and the shining theology that illuminated the medieval world. But more than knowledge, he longed for something that shimmered just out of reach, a peace not yet found, a love too vast for words. At night, when quiet settled over the house, he sometimes slipped away to look at the stars, asking himself softly why the beauty of the world made him long for another world altogether. In those moments of quiet wonder, something new began to take root, something that would later burst into the full flame of a vocation he could not yet understand. The seed of longing grew silently, nourished by his mother's gentle holiness and the stillness of the countryside, as though grace itself leaned close to whisper that the deepest journeys often begin long before we name them. His youth was not without its struggles. Bernard's heart was sensitive, and the world around him often struck him as loud, restless, and painfully transitory. He found it difficult to pour his whole self into pursuits that seemed too small for the grandeur he sensed within the soul. For a time, he considered a life of learning, perhaps even joining the schools where scholars debated philosophy with fierce delight. But although the intellectual fire appealed to him, the noise of ambition did not. Something inside him recoiled at the idea of chasing worldly praise or academic triumph. And even in his late adolescence he began to withdraw, searching inwardly for a truth strong enough to root him. His mother's death around this time deepened the quiet in him, carving out a hollow space where grief mingled with grace. Her absence left an ache so profound that Bernard later confessed it changed something in him forever, teaching him that even the purest earthly love is fragile, and that only a love anchored in God could quench the thirst that plagued his restless spirit. It was during this tender and vulnerable period that Bernard began to feel the first unmistakable call to monastic life. It came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gentle, persistent tug on the heart, a drawing toward a silence that seemed to promise freedom rather than isolation. Whenever he visited churches, or walked alone on winter mornings, or listened to scripture being read aloud, he felt something within him settle, as though the world briefly aligned with a deeper truth he had always known, but could never articulate. Still he hesitated, for choosing the monastery would not only uproot his future, but would shock his family, who expected him to marry, manage lands, and live the noble life worthy of his lineage. Yet the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became, until one day he realized with startling clarity that he could no longer pretend. His soul sought something the world could not give, and he understood that God was inviting him to leave behind everything familiar and step into a life shaped entirely by prayer, humility, and the quiet rhythm of conversion. Even so, Bernard's vocation did not unfold quietly, for the fire within him seemed to ignite everyone around him. As he shared his desire for the monastic path with those closest to him, something extraordinary happened. One by one, his brothers, his cousins, and his friends felt stirred by his conviction and chose to follow him. It was as though Bernard's longing awakened their own hidden longings, drawing entire groups of young men toward a dream of holiness they had never dared to imagine. Some were close companions, others were men who had merely observed Bernard's way of living and felt inspired without fully knowing why. The movement grew like a small, luminous wildfire, spreading through their social circles with unexpected grace. Bernard, barely more than a young man himself, suddenly found that more than 24 souls were preparing to leave the world behind, not because he commanded them, but because the sincerity of his passion made them believe that giving everything to God was not only possible, but deeply desirable. When the day finally arrived for them to depart for the monastery of Citeaux, the world around them fell into a hush, as though creation itself recognized the gravity of their choice. They walked in small clusters, some speaking softly, others silent in fear or anticipation, and Bernard walked among them with a calm that seemed to come from some place beyond his frail humanity. The sight of so many young men surrendering noble privileges and promising futures caused murmurs across the countryside, but Bernard's heart felt only a quiet certainty, as if each step brought him closer to the home he had longed for since childhood. For all his sensitivity and his delicate health, Bernard carried within him a courage that surprised even himself, a willingness to trust entirely in a God who leads souls through valleys they cannot yet understand. Yet as they approached the austere gates of Citeaux, a place known for its severe discipline and stark simplicity, Bernard felt a tremor of uncertainty pass through him. He wondered whether he was strong enough, whether his companions would endure the harshness of the life that awaited them, whether he had led them wisely or recklessly. But the moment the gates opened and he stepped inside the solemn stillness of the monastery, he felt that familiar peace rise again within him, the same peace that had whispered to him beneath the stars as a boy. And though the path ahead would be far harder than he could imagine, he sensed also that God had brought him to the threshold of something profound, something that would shape not only his life, but the future of Europe. And so, with a breath both hesitant and hopeful, Bernard crossed into the cloister, carrying with him a heart full of longing and a courage shaped by grace. Stepping from the world he knew into the world God had prepared for him since the beginning. In that moment, the restlessness of his youth melted into purpose, and the first chapter of his extraordinary journey quietly began to unfold, like a candle lit in the stillness of dawn, waiting to see how far its light would reach. Perhaps, even then, some quiet part of him wondered where such longing would lead, and how a single soul's desire for God might reshape the lives of countless others across generations. As the first days at Citeaux folded themselves quietly into memory, Part 2 begins by following the gentle thread left behind, that wondering about where longing might lead, and how one young man's courage could draw so many others into the hidden life of God. The monastery welcomed Bernard and his companions not with jubilant celebration, but with the sober stillness characteristic of the Cistercians. Silence clung to the corridors, and the rhythm of prayer shaped every moment from the earliest light until the deep hush of night. Yet even within that silence, something powerful stirred in Bernard, a sense that he had finally reached the place where the desires of his soul could breathe freely. Still, the decision that had carried him here, bold, beautiful, and costly, was only the beginning. And now he faced the deeper work of allowing God to remake him entirely from within. It was during these early months of monastic life that Bernard discovered the vastness of commitment he had embraced. For the discipline at Citeaux was more severe than he had imagined. The fasting was strict, the manual labor relentless, the nights long, and the hours of prayer demanded a concentration that pushed his frail body to its limit. He was naturally delicate, and although his spirit soared, his strength often faltered. Some days he struggled simply to remain standing in the choir during the chanting of the psalms, and on the coldest mornings his hands trembled as he carried out his tasks in the fields. Yet he refused to complain, embracing each difficulty with a fervor that astonished even the older monks. The others who had followed him to Citeaux watched him closely, some worrying silently, others drawing strength from his perseverance. At times, Bernard wondered whether he had been wrong to bring so many with him, whether the sacrifices required here would prove too heavy for their youthful zeal. But the more he watched them settle into the cloister's rhythm, the more he realized that their calling had not begun with him alone. Rather, God had used his longing as a spark, igniting something far greater than his own desires. In the chapel, during the soft glow of early morning, Bernard often found his thoughts drifting back to his mother, who had once prayed that her children would love God above all else. He felt her presence in moments of uncertainty, as though her quiet faith had been placed like a mantle upon him, urging him forward even when he felt unworthy or unprepared. That memory strengthened him, but it also humbled him, reminding him that holiness was not an achievement to grasp, but a surrender to embrace, a continual letting go that allowed grace to do its hidden work. Yet Citeaux was not only a place of physical rigor, it was also a place of profound spiritual formation. Under the guidance of Abbot Stephen Harding, Bernard encountered a vision of monastic life that cut through every trace of worldliness. Stephen was a man of gentle authority, his wisdom refined by years of prayer and discernment. And in him, Bernard found a spiritual father who recognized the depth of his vocation. Stephen saw in Bernard a brilliant mind and a heart burning with desire for God. But he also saw the dangers of excessive austerity, the temptation to push oneself beyond what the body could bear. With patient firmness, he taught Bernard the importance of balance, urging him to temper zeal with gentleness, to remember that holiness flourishes not through heroic displays of self-denial, but through steadfast fidelity to God's quiet whisper. During this time, Bernard began to grow in ways he could never have foreseen. His prayer deepened, shifting from the fiery intensity of youthful conversion to a steadier flame that illuminated the interior chambers of his soul. In the silence of the cloister, he discovered a kind of companionship with Christ that softened his heart, teaching him tenderness toward others and humility before the mysteries of faith. Scripture opened like a living landscape before him, revealing spiritual depths he had never sensed before. His understanding of love matured, and his devotion to the Virgin Mary blossomed into the gentle affection that would later find its way into his sermons and hymns. The monks around him felt the change, sensing in Bernard a combination of purity, insight, and sincerity that drew them closer not to him, but to God. His presence steadied them, especially the younger men who still struggled to adjust to the rigors of Cistercian life. Bernard encouraged them quietly, not with speeches or instruction, but with the simple witness of endurance and trust. And although he was still so young, barely in his 20s, his spiritual maturity began to shine through in ways that startled the elders. Gradually, whispers began circulating through the cloister. Bernard possessed a gift for guiding souls. Abbot Stephen noticed it too, observing how the monks instinctively sought Bernard's counsel in moments of discouragement or confusion. At first, Bernard tried to avoid such conversations, fearing that attention would pull him away from humility. But eventually he accepted that God was working through him in ways he had never anticipated. It frightened him at times, for he had come to Citeaux seeking a hidden life, a life removed from the world. He longed for prayer, not leadership. He desired silence, not influence. Yet influence seemed to follow him like a shadow he could not outrun. Then came the pivotal moment that would transform not only Bernard's life, but the future of the entire Cistercian order. The community had grown significantly since Bernard and his companions joined, and a new foundation was needed to accommodate the expanding number of monks. Abbot Stephen, after much discernment, chose Bernard to lead the group that would establish the new monastery. Bernard was stunned, even troubled. The idea of becoming an abbot seemed overwhelming, even impossible. He felt too inexperienced, too frail, too unworthy of such responsibility. He begged to be excused, pleading that others were better suited, but Stephen remained firm. He told Bernard that God often chooses the weak to reveal his strength, and that refusing the call out of fear was no less dangerous than embracing it with pride. The monks who were to join him looked at him with trust, believing that Bernard's guidance would help them build a community rooted in purity and devotion. Their confidence touched him deeply, stirring both humility and dread. He prayed long into the night, asking God for clarity, for courage, for the grace to do only what was asked of him. At dawn, after a sleepless vigil, Bernard understood that obedience, however painful, was the heart of monastic life. And so he accepted the task not with triumph, but with trembling, knowing that whatever lay ahead would ask more of him than he had ever imagined. With quiet steps and a heart full of uncertainty, he prepared to lead his brothers into the wilderness where the new monastery would rise, a place that would soon bear the name Clairvaux. And as they set out, Bernard could not help but wonder, in the secret chambers of his soul, how a life once shaped only by longing had begun to lead him toward the heavy mantle of responsibility he had never sought. As the small band of monks followed Bernard out of Citeaux and into the unknown wilderness that awaited them, Part 3 flows naturally from the trembling acceptance that had closed the previous chapter, carrying forward the sense of uncertainty and obedience that now shaped every step of their journey. The land chosen for the new foundation lay deep within a rugged valley, a place thick with forests, damp soil, and a silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of birds. It was a harsh place, desolate and unwelcoming, far from the gentle hills of Bernard's childhood or the orderly rhythms of Citeaux. Yet for the monks who sought a life stripped of comfort and attachment, the valley's barrenness felt strangely fitting. Abbot Stephen had chosen it precisely because its roughness would forge a community built on perseverance, humility, and pure reliance on God. When Bernard and his companions arrived at the site, the land seemed almost to resist them. Dense thickets made walking difficult, and the soil was so stony that clearing patches for crops felt nearly impossible. The old stories speak of the valley being called the Valley of Absinthe, a name that hinted at bitterness and sterility, as though creation itself had withdrawn sweetness from this lonely corner of the world. The monks set to work immediately, building simple wooden structures to shelter them and clearing enough earth to begin planting crops that would sustain them in the coming seasons. Days blended into one another as they labored from dawn until dusk, their hands blistered, their bodies aching, and their spirits tested by the harsh demands of the wilderness. Bernard worked alongside them, refusing to spare himself even though his delicate constitution often trembled under the strain. His body grew thinner, his face paler, and his energy sometimes faltered so drastically that his brothers feared he might collapse. Yet whenever they urged him to rest, he resisted gently, insisting that he had no right to ease when others could not claim the same. This first stretch of life at the new monastery was marked by scarcity. Food was limited, and the monks often endured long stretches of hunger as they waited for their crops to take root. Winters were particularly brutal, with icy winds that crept through their thin clothing and little wood to warm their crude dwellings. In those months, it was not unusual for the monks to go to bed shivering, their stomachs aching from hunger, their bodies weakened by the harsh demands of manual labor. But within the austerity, something luminous began to take shape, something that could not be measured in comfort or physical strength. The monks were slowly being bound together through shared sacrifice, their hearts joined in a common desire to draw closer to God by stripping away everything that distracted them from His voice. Bernard's leadership during these days was marked not by authority, but by gentleness. He spoke rarely, prayed constantly, and listened deeply to his brothers, encouraging them to persevere not through force, but through a tenderness that surprised many who had expected a fiery and ascetic young abbot. Although Bernard pushed himself with alarming severity, he treated others with compassion, urging moderation for those whose health faltered, and offering counsel that lifted spirits without making demands. This juxtaposition, fierce discipline for himself, yet mercy toward others, made a profound impression on the community. Still, Bernard's own extreme asceticism concerned the older monks who had accompanied him from Cîteaux. They watched his body weaken day by day, his cheeks hollowing, his steps growing unsteady, and his once bright eyes dimming with fatigue. Eventually, the situation grew serious enough that Cîteaux intervened. Abbot Stephen, deeply worried that Bernard would destroy his health before his gifts had even begun to mature, sent instructions ordering Bernard to moderate his practices. At first, Bernard resisted, believing that easing his austerity would invite spiritual complacency. But when he saw how his stubbornness troubled the monks who loved him, he finally softened. With humility and obedience, he accepted the correction and allowed himself to eat more regularly and rest when needed. This moment marked a quiet but important turning point, teaching Bernard that holiness thrives not in extremes, but in harmony, not in punishing the body, but in offering it to God with reverent stewardship. Meanwhile, the monastery, soon to be named Clairvaux, the Valley of Light, began to take shape. Though still struggling with poverty, the community slowly grew as new vocations arrived, drawn by the example of men who lived with sincerity, peace, and radiant dedication. Word of Bernard's wisdom, purity, and gentle strength started to spread beyond the valley, carried by travelers, by monks visiting from other houses, and by nobles who had heard whispers of a young abbot whose presence stirred hearts to conversion. People began to seek him out for counsel, though he resisted the attention as much as possible. Bernard longed to devote himself entirely to prayer, to the chanting of psalms, to the quiet rhythm that allowed him to rest in God without distraction. Yet, even in these earliest years, he sensed that his life would not remain hidden at Clairvaux, that God was preparing him for tasks he did not yet understand and had never desired. Within the monastery, Bernard's teachings began to form the spiritual character of the community. He emphasized purity of intention, a heart that sought God alone without seeking reward or recognition. He encouraged simplicity in all things: simple food, simple clothing, simple speech, believing that simplicity cleared the way for the heart to dwell in God's presence. He nurtured devotion to the Virgin Mary, teaching the monks to entrust their struggles to her gentle care, to let her tenderness soften the hardness that sometimes took root in the soul when suffering became overwhelming. He taught them that love was the foundation of obedience, that humility was the path to peace, and that the discipline they endured had meaning only if it led them closer to Christ's love. Despite the challenges, the monastery's spiritual and communal life flourished. The brothers prayed together, worked together, and learned together, creating a harmony that transformed the once barren valley into a place of light and grace. Slowly, the harshness of the land softened under their perseverance. Crops began to grow more reliably, the buildings expanded, and the community became strong enough to sustain itself. Something beautiful was happening, something tender, fragile, and deeply sacred. Bernard saw this transformation with awe, recognizing that the light emerging from this valley was not his doing, but God's, and yet, beneath his gratitude, a quiet awareness stirred. The peace he cherished might not be his forever. Even now, letters arrived seeking his advice. Visitors waited for hours, hoping to speak with him. Other monasteries asked for his guidance, sensing in him a wisdom beyond his years. Bernard tried to ignore these signs, hoping that the call beyond Clairvaux would fade. But the world had begun to take notice, and the whispers of his influence were growing louder. For now, though, in these early years, Bernard allowed himself to rest in the fragile but radiant peace of the valley that had become his home. His heart, once restless with longing, now found solace in the chanting of psalms, the labor in the fields, and the companionship of men united in their pursuit of God. Still, even as he cherished this hidden life, a gentle question remained, rising like mist from the valley floor. How long could such serenity endure in a world so fractured and hungry for guidance? And when the world finally came knocking, would Bernard be strong enough to answer? As the Valley of Light slowly transformed from a barren wilderness into a place where prayer and perseverance took root, Part 4 rises gently from the lingering question of how long such serenity could endure before the world pierced the cloister's silence. For a brief season, Bernard allowed himself to believe that Clairvaux might remain a secluded haven, a place where he and his brothers could live out their days hidden beneath the gentle rhythms of work, study, and prayer. But God, who had drawn Bernard into the monastery through longing, was now preparing to draw him further outward through obedience, for the growth of Clairvaux soon became impossible to ignore. New vocations continued arriving in surprising numbers, each young man drawn not by comfort or fame, but by the reputation of a community whose simplicity and harmony seemed to reveal something of heaven's quiet order. These arrivals flowed in steadily, like streams filling a basin, until the monastery swelled beyond its capacity, and the valley that once felt empty now pulsed with youthful fervor and a rising sense of mission. Bernard watched this with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He had hoped for a life of stillness, yet the very simplicity he cultivated, his tenderness toward the weak, his steady devotion, the clarity of his spiritual insight, made Clairvaux a beacon that drew souls from across the region. The monastery's growth was beautiful, but it also brought challenges. More mouths to feed meant more labor. More hearts to shepherd meant more spiritual responsibility. And with each new arrival, Bernard felt the weight of leadership settle more fully upon his shoulders. He carried it quietly, prayerfully, but not without a certain tremor of fear. For he knew his own fragility well. His body remained frail, his health unpredictable, and he worried that the burden would become too much. Yet every time he knelt in prayer, he sensed a gentle assurance, not that he was strong enough, but that grace would sustain him even in weakness. Clairvaux's reputation spread further when monks and lay people alike began sharing stories of Bernard's wisdom and the transformative peace of the valley. Nobles sent their sons to be formed under his guidance. Other monasteries sought his counsel in times of conflict. Bishops, hearing whispers of a young abbot possessing uncommon clarity and spiritual discernment, reached out to him for advice on matters of ecclesial discipline and reform. Bernard tried to resist this widening influence, but even his reluctance seemed only to deepen people's respect for him. His desire to remain hidden became, paradoxically, the very quality that convinced others of his sanctity. And so the world began to press in gently, asking more of him than he wished to give. But the most significant turning point came when Abbot Stephen and the leaders of the Cistercian order began discussing the need for new foundations. The order had grown rapidly, its reputation for purity and simplicity attracting men from all walks of life. And Clairvaux, with its flourishing community, served as a model for what these new monasteries might become. The elders saw in Bernard a natural leader, someone who could shape the emerging identity of the Cistercians with his devotion, humility, and spiritual wisdom. They approached him with requests to send monks from Clairvaux to establish daughter houses, believing that the grace evident in his community could be shared throughout Europe. Bernard hesitated, fearing that expansion might dilute the purity of the original vision. Yet he also knew that obedience was the heart of monastic life, and that resisting God's work out of fear would be contrary to the very path he had embraced. With prayerful discernment, he agreed, sending trusted brothers to begin new monasteries in the same spirit as Clairvaux. This period marked the beginning of Bernard's reluctant emergence as a central figure within the growing Cistercian family. He found himself writing letters to guide other abbots, offering counsel to communities struggling to maintain discipline, and quietly mediating disputes that arose as the order navigated its expanding influence. These letters, simple yet profound, would later be recognized as cornerstones of medieval spirituality, revealing a heart that understood both the demands of holiness and the frailty of human nature. Bernard wrote with tenderness and firmness, always urging his correspondence toward charity, humility, and unwavering fidelity to God's calling. Yet even as he offered guidance beyond the cloister, Bernard remained deeply devoted to the formation of his own monks. He spent long hours in conversation with those who struggled with doubt or discouragement, offering counsel shaped by his own early battles. He reminded them often that holiness was a slow unfolding, not a sudden achievement, and that God's grace worked most powerfully in hearts that embraced their limitations, rather than hiding them. In the refectory, during simple meals eaten in silence, Bernard would glance at his growing community and feel a mixture of awe and responsibility. He loved his brothers with a tenderness that surprised even him, a fatherly affection that softened his stern commitment to discipline. For in each face he saw the mystery of a soul seeking God, a fragile yet radiant flame entrusted to his care. Despite these consolations, Bernard struggled internally with the demands placed upon him. His longing for solitude did not diminish. In fact, the more the world sought his voice, the deeper his desire for silence grew. There were nights when he remained awake long after the other monks slept, kneeling alone in the dim chapel where the glow of a single candle flickered before the altar. In those quiet hours, he poured his fears before God. Fears of failing his brothers, fears of pride creeping unnoticed into his heart, fears that his growing influence might draw him away from the contemplation he cherished above all else. These prayers were raw, honest, and deeply vulnerable, revealing a man who carried the heavy weight of leadership with trembling hands, trusting entirely in grace to bear what he could not. Amid this spiritual tension, Clairvaux continued to thrive. Visitors arrived seeking counsel, healing, or prayer. Some returned home transformed by what they had encountered. Others chose to stay and join the community. Bernard greeted these seekers with kindness, but also with discernment, recognizing that not every stirring of emotion was a genuine vocation. He guided them gently, always directing attention away from himself and toward the one whose love alone could satisfy the heart. His gift for spiritual direction deepened during these years, and though he resisted praise, many left Clairvaux convinced they had encountered a man uniquely attuned to the movements of the Spirit. It was during this time that Bernard also began writing more extensively, crafting sermons and treatises that reflected the unfolding depths of his spiritual life. His writings on love, humility, grace, and the Virgin Mary would become treasures of Christian tradition, though he wrote them not for fame, but for the nourishment of those entrusted to him. He once told his brothers that writing was a form of service, a way of offering to others the fruits of contemplation in hopes that they might be strengthened on their own journeys toward God. But even as Bernard poured himself into these tasks, he sensed that the path ahead would only grow heavier. The world beyond the monastery was unraveling with political tensions, theological disputes, and conflicts within the church. And though Bernard longed to remain quietly at Clairvaux, God was preparing him for a role that would carry him far beyond the valley's peaceful borders. For now, though, he stood at the threshold of this broader mission, unaware of how profoundly his influence would reshape the spiritual and political landscape of his time. As the chapter settles into its quiet close, Bernard's heart returns once more to the valley that had become his refuge. The wind rustles through the trees, the monks chant softly in the chapel, and the peace he longs for remains just within reach. Yet beneath it all, a gentle question lingers like a whispered invitation. How long can a soul remain hidden when God has already begun to call it into the heart of the world's turmoil? As the valley of Clairvaux continued to hum with the gentle rhythms of prayer and work, Part 5 opens by following the quiet but persistent echo left behind by that haunting question of how long a soul can remain hidden when God is already drawing it toward the world's unrest. Bernard had given his heart fully to the life of the cloister, to the quiet sweetness of contemplation that had first drawn him toward monastic life. Yet he was beginning to realize that the walls of Clairvaux could not shelter him forever. The very grace that blessed the monastery was now shining outward through its suns, spreading like light over the hills and forests that encircled the valley. And as that light stretched beyond the horizon, people from far beyond the region began to sense something stirring, a new voice, a new clarity, a new spiritual presence that seemed to call them toward conversion and renewal. Bernard did not seek this attention, and at times he feared it. Yet it arrived nonetheless, like a gentle but unyielding tide pulling him outward, step by obedient step. The first signs of this widening influence emerged through letters. In an age when messages traveled slowly and writing required patient intention, the arrival of a letter often carried the weight of a spoken visit. Bernard's letters began simply, sent mostly to his monks who had left to found new houses or to friends seeking encouragement. But word quickly spread that his words carried not only wisdom, but a tenderness that pierced through confusion and stirred souls toward repentance and peace. Requests arrived asking for guidance on spiritual matters, how to navigate temptations, how to cultivate humility, how to persevere through dryness in prayer. Bernard responded with the honesty of a man who knew these struggles personally. He wrote with gentleness, weaving scripture with insight drawn from his own inner battles, shaping each letter with a fatherly concern for the soul of the reader. Soon, nobles, abbots, bishops, and eventually even rulers sought his counsel, sensing that his heart was free from ambition and motivated only by love for God. Yet Bernard was always uneasy when dealing with those in positions of authority, for he recognized the danger that influence could bring to a monk who desired only God. He approached each correspondence with trembling, aware that a single poorly chosen word could lead others astray. Before writing, he often prayed in the dim chapel, asking Christ to guard his intentions and purify his thoughts. The letters that emerged from these moments would later be treasured as masterpieces of Christian wisdom, but at the time, Bernard wrote them with no thought for posterity. He wrote simply to console, to guide, to correct where necessary, and to point toward truth with the tenderness of a shepherd whose heart ached for the good of his flock. As Bernard's spiritual influence grew, so too did the demands placed on him. Visitors arrived at Clairvaux seeking spiritual healing. Some came burdened with sorrow, others seeking direction, still others desperate for peace in the midst of inner turmoil. Bernard welcomed them reluctantly, wishing always that someone else could shoulder the responsibility, yet unable to ignore the needs of those God placed before him. His humility and sincerity drew people in, yet Bernard himself felt constantly overwhelmed, aware of his own weaknesses and inadequacies. He often wondered why God allowed so many to look to him for guidance when he felt himself only a beginner in the school of love. This sense of inadequacy, far from weakening him, shaped the profound humility that would become a hallmark of his sanctity. Conflict within the church soon reached Bernard's doorstep, forcing him into disputes he had never wished to confront. The early 12th century was marked by tension between those who sought to revive strict monastic discipline and those who argued for more relaxed practices. Some communities resented the Cistercians' rapid growth, accusing them of pride or excessive rigor. Others doubted Bernard's judgment, questioning whether someone so young should wield such influence. Letters circulated criticizing Clairvaux's practices, and disagreements sometimes escalated into open hostility. The tensions pained Bernard deeply, for he longed only to foster unity and holiness, not discord. Yet he realized that fidelity to truth demanded firmness, even when it attracted misunderstanding and criticism. In response, he wrote letters urging reconciliation, urging charity, urging simplicity and humility as the foundation of all monastic life. Though his words sometimes carried sharp warnings, they were rooted always in love, a desire that every soul might return to the purity of seeking God alone. Their tone, tender yet unyielding, revealed something essential about Bernard's character. He was not a man who sought conflict, but neither was he afraid of it when the peace of the church hung in the balance. His writings reflected his sorrow at the divisions tearing through monastic communities, and he pleaded with abbots to see one another not as rivals, but as brothers journeying towards the same eternal home. The emotional toll of these conflicts was heavy, and Bernard often retreated into longer periods of prayer, seeking refuge in the presence of God. These retreats were not escapes from responsibility, but necessary replenishment. For Bernard felt keenly that he could offer nothing to others unless he first received strength in the silence of contemplation. During this period, Bernard also began shaping the soul of Clairvaux through his sermons, especially his sermons on the Song of Songs, which revealed the depth of his mystical theology. In these sermons, he described the soul's relationship with God as a tender, intimate union marked by desire, longing, and divine love. Though his language was gentle and poetic, it carried a theological richness that would shape Christian spirituality for centuries. The monks who listened felt their hearts open to a deeper love of God, discovering in Bernard's words a path toward union that honored both the mind and the heart. Bernard's teachings on love, divine, pure, self-giving, would become his greatest theological legacy, though he offered them in the humility of a man simply sharing the fruits of his prayer. As Clairvaux grew, and Bernard's writings circulated across Europe, more voices called upon him to intervene in matters beyond the monastery. Some conflicts involved disputes between clergy, others between nobles, and still others between entire regions struggling with political or spiritual upheaval. Bernard responded reluctantly, always reminding those who sought his help that he was only a monk, not a judge, not a statesman. Yet his clarity of thought and purity of intention made him a natural mediator, and soon his name was spoken in courts and councils far from the valley he cherished. The more the world intruded, the more Bernard felt torn between obedience to the needs of the church and his longing for contemplative stillness. He lived in a growing tension, one that would only deepen as events unfolded. And so this chapter draws toward its quiet close, leaving Bernard standing at a threshold he can neither retreat from nor fully embrace. His letters have begun shaping the church. His counsel is sought by leaders. His teachings are spreading far beyond Clairvaux, yet his heart remains tender, his body fragile, his spirit yearning for the silence he fears he will soon lose. In the stillness of the valley at dusk, he wonders how a soul can remain faithful to God's gentle whisper amid the rising clamor of the world's demands. And beneath that wondering lies a deeper question yet to be answered. Will the growing waves of conflict pull him into waters far rougher than he has ever known? And will grace be enough to sustain him when the storms finally break? As Bernard's words continued to ripple outward from Clairvaux, Part 6 begins by following the quiet tension that closed the previous section, that uneasy sense that the serenity of the valley could not shield him forever from the storm gathering beyond its borders. By now, Bernard was no longer merely the young abbot of a flourishing monastery. He had become a spiritual voice that Europe was beginning to lean upon, a man whose clarity of judgment made him both trusted and, increasingly, feared. And it was in this widening field of influence that Bernard encountered one of the great pains of his life, the conflict with brilliant minds within the church, whose ideas stirred both fascination and danger. Among these, none would affect him as profoundly as the controversy that emerged around Peter Abelard, the celebrated scholar whose dazzling intellect and bold speculations drew countless admirers while unsettling the foundations of theology. Bernard had not sought this dispute. He admired learning and valued sincere inquiry, but he also sensed that scholarship unmoored from humility had the power to wound the soul of the church. Abelard, brilliant yet restless, had a mind that worked like a blade, keen, sharp, capable of carving through centuries of thought, but also capable of cutting into mysteries meant to be held with reverence. Reports reached Bernard that Abelard's teachings, though captivating, were stirring confusion among students and clergy. His insistence on dissecting the mysteries of the Trinity, his speculative interpretations of faith, and his readiness to apply reason where the Church invited contemplation troubled many. Letters arrived asking Bernard to intervene, to offer guidance, to protect the faithful from ideas that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of orthodoxy. At first, Bernard resisted. He longed to avoid intellectual battles, knowing how such conflicts could inflame pride and deepen divisions. He had no desire to humiliate a fellow Christian, especially one whose gifts were undeniably extraordinary. But as Abelard's influence grew, and as disputes multiplied across universities and monasteries, Bernard realized he could no longer remain silent. The Church was at a crossroads, and the unity he cherished trembled under the strain of competing visions. He prayed often and long before taking any action, kneeling alone in the dim chapel as candles flickered gently before the crucifix. He asked God for guidance, for purity of intention, and for the grace to act not from pride or fear, but from love. A love for truth, for the Church, and even for the man whose ideas he would soon challenge. When Bernard finally entered the debate, he did so with a heavy heart, fully aware that the outcome would leave lasting wounds. The confrontation unfolded at the Council of Sens, where bishops, theologians, and monks gathered to address the rising controversy. Abelard arrived confident, towering in intellect, and assured of his ability to out-argue anyone who opposed him. Bernard arrived trembling, trusting not in rhetorical skill, but in a conviction shaped by prayer and humility. Bernard refused to engage Abelard in open debate, not out of fear, as some whispered, but because he believed that trying to conquer another man's brilliance in public would turn the search for truth into a spectacle. Instead, Bernard presented his concerns quietly and clearly, pointing to the dangers of treating divine mystery as a puzzle for human logic to solve. His testimony was simple, rooted in scripture and tradition, free from flourish. Yet its sincerity pierced through the hall. Abelard, realizing he could not dominate the discussion through argument, suddenly withdrew from the council, leaving many stunned. That moment, though it seemed a victory for Bernard, wounded him deeply. He had not desired triumph. He had desired understanding, unity, and the safety of the faith entrusted to the Church. But the result painted him in the eyes of some as a destroyer of a great thinker, a man who stifled intellectual freedom. This reputation grieved Bernard profoundly. He later prayed for Abelard, expressing sorrow that their paths had collided in conflict rather than harmony. He urged his monks to speak charitably of the troubled scholar, and even welcomed Abelard into a Cistercian monastery toward the end of his life, where he found a measure of peace. Bernard's critics, however, did not relent. Some accused him of being rigid, fearful of new ideas, hostile to scholarship. These accusations pierced him, for he loved learning deeply and respected the gift of intelligence. Yet he bore these judgments silently, offering the pain as a hidden sacrifice, trusting that God alone understood the purity of his intentions. This controversy represented only one of the many conflicts into which Bernard was reluctantly drawn. His clarity of vision made him a natural defender of orthodoxy, and in an age when theological confusion threatened unity, many looked to him as a shepherd capable of discerning truth amid noise. Letters arrived reporting disputes between monastic communities, moral failings among clergy, and tensions between bishops struggling for authority. Bernard responded to each plea with careful prayer and a heavy sense of duty. He longed to withdraw into silence, yet whenever he tried to step back, another crisis emerged that drew him outward again. His influence was no longer local or regional, it was becoming continental. Yet even as his public responsibilities grew, Bernard remained deeply attentive to the spiritual formation of his monks. He would often gather them in the quiet of the evening, speaking softly but with conviction, urging them to remain humble, to avoid the temptations that accompany growing renown. He warned them that the world praises holiness from a distance, but resists it up close, and that anyone who seeks to defend truth must be prepared for misunderstanding and hostility. These lessons were not abstract reflections. They were shaped by Bernard's own wounds, the hidden griefs that settled quietly in his heart as he navigated the painful divisions of the Church. In these years, Bernard's health began to decline further. The strain of travel, the mental exhaustion of mediating disputes, and the emotional burden of confronting fellow Christians weighed heavily on him. He endured frequent fevers, severe stomach troubles, and long stretches when his frail body nearly collapsed under the pressure of his responsibilities. Yet even in weakness, he continued to write, teach, and guide, believing that the Lord would sustain him until his task was completed. His letters from this period reveal a man who was simultaneously weary and luminous, burdened yet full of compassion, a man who suffered quietly even as others leaned upon him. And through it all, a question whispered through the corridors of his heart. Could these conflicts be instruments of grace, shaping him in ways he did not yet understand? How does a soul remain tender while defending truth? How does one stand firm without becoming bitter? Bernard carried these questions with him like silent companions, trusting that God would answer them not through words, but through the unfolding journey ahead. As this chapter draws to a close, the valley of Clairvaux remains Bernard's refuge, the place where his weary soul returns after each exhausting journey. The monks chant softly, the candles glow in the chapel, and the simple fragrance of wood smoke rises into the night sky. Yet even here, amid the peace he loves, Bernard can feel the world pulling at him with growing urgency. Conflicts are deepening, the Church is straining under pressure, and Europe is beginning to tremble with the early signs of turmoil. And so we leave him standing in that quiet chapel, worn and humbled, asking himself whether a single monk can truly bear the weight of a church searching for unity, and whether grace will be enough to sustain him when the next summons arrives. As Bernard knelt in the quiet chapel at Clairvaux, exhausted from disputes that left deep lines across his gentle spirit, Part 7 begins by following the lingering ache from the previous chapter, the sense that his life, once rooted in silence, was being steadily drawn into conflicts far larger than any one man should have to bear. The controversies within the Church had already tested him profoundly, leaving him weary not only in body but in heart. Yet the most demanding trial still lay ahead, one that would stretch across kingdoms and plunge Bernard into a struggle that would shape the fate of Europe. The papal schism that erupted like a wound at the center of the Church he loved so deeply. This was no mere theological quarrel or intellectual dispute. It was a fracture at the highest level of governance, a division that threatened unity, sowed confusion among the faithful, and pitted powerful families and nations against one another. The stakes were devastatingly high, for the unity of Christendom itself depended on how this crisis would unfold. The schism began after the death of Pope Honorius II in 1130, when the College of Cardinals split into two factions. Each elected its own pontiff, Innocent II on one side and Anacletus II on the other. Suddenly, Europe was torn between two claimants to the papacy. Some kingdoms supported Innocent. Others threw their allegiance behind Anacletus, influenced by political alliances or personal loyalties. Bishops were divided, monasteries confused, and the ordinary faithful found themselves asking an anguished question: who is the true shepherd? In such a moment of turmoil, one might hope the Church would turn to its most seasoned statesmen or scholars. But instead, eyes turned to a frail monk hidden in a valley. Letters arrived at Clairvaux with urgent pleas. Bernard must come, Bernard must mediate, Bernard must discern, Bernard must lead. Though he longed to remain cloistered in prayer, Bernard could not ignore the cries of a church fracturing before his eyes. The task before him was immense. Leaders begged him to support Innocent X, believing that Bernard's voice would help unify Europe around the legitimate successor. Bernard hesitated, knowing the decision would thrust him into the heart of political storms he had never sought. But after prayerful discernment, he found clarity in a quiet conviction. Innocent II, though politically weaker, embodied the integrity and continuity of the Church's tradition. With trembling obedience, Bernard stepped into the crisis, shouldering a burden that few could have carried without breaking. His mission required him to travel across kingdoms, standing before monarchs, nobles, councils, and clergy with a message that united moral conviction with spiritual insight. His words were not those of a politician, but of a shepherd pleading for the unity of Christ's flock. He urged kings to look beyond their alliances, beyond their pride, beyond their strategic gains, and to embrace the truth not because it was convenient, but because it was right. His first journey carried him into France, where many nobles were leaning toward the rival claimant. Bernard met with bishops who were torn, families who disagreed, and rulers who demanded explanations. Some listened with reverence, sensing the weight of divine wisdom in his words. Others bristled, questioning why a monk presumed to advise the powerful. Yet everywhere he went, Bernard remained steady, rooted in humility even as he spoke with authority. His presence carried something unmistakable, a spiritual gravity that pierced through arguments and touched the conscience. Slowly, hearts began to shift. Regions that had wavered in confusion found clarity. Bishops who had previously supported the opposing side reconsidered their allegiance. A movement began, subtle at first, then steadily gaining momentum. But Bernard's greatest challenge awaited him in Italy, where the schism was fiercest. Traveling across the treacherous Alps with a frail body that barely endured the journey, Bernard pushed himself beyond physical limits. Fevers tormented him. His stomach, long weakened by years of fasting and strain, rebelled against the travel. More than once, his companions feared he might collapse in the snow. Yet Bernard pressed onward, driven by a sense that God had entrusted him with a mission far greater than his frailty. When he finally arrived in Italy, he found cities divided, families quarreling, and clergy deeply entrenched in rival factions. The conflict was no longer merely about papal legitimacy. It had become a struggle for power, wealth, and influence. Bernard confronted these tensions with a courage that surprised even him. He spoke before councils with honesty, urging them to see beyond political gain and to choose unity. His words were not laced with condemnation, but with a deep sorrow that pierced through hardened hearts. Many listeners wept, not from fear, but from the sense that they were witnessing a soul entirely surrendered to God's will. Bernard's advocacy expanded further when he traveled to the Kingdom of Germany, addressing Emperor Lothair, who held significant influence in determining the schism's outcome. Standing before a ruler whose political weight could shift the balance of Europe, Bernard spoke as one who carried no earthly authority, yet radiated a power that kings recognized instinctively. His humility disarmed resistance, his sincerity softened pride, and his clarity guided decisions that would eventually help resolve the schism in favor of Innocent II. It was Bernard's intervention, his relentless travel, his heartfelt appeals, his theological clarity, that eventually swayed the tide and brought the majority of Christendom to unity under Innocent II. Yet this triumph came at a terrible personal cost. The endless journeys drained Bernard's already fragile health. He suffered intense fatigue, nights of sleepless agony, and days when he could barely stand. His spirit often wavered under the weight of constant conflict, and he longed desperately for the peace of Clairvaux. But whenever he returned home, rest eluded him. Letters awaited him. More disputes needed settling. More appeals called him back into the world's turmoil. Bernard's life had become a cycle of leaving and returning, of pouring himself out until he was empty, then offering the emptiness itself to God. Through it all, one question echoed in Bernard's heart with increasing insistence. How does a man remain whole when the world demands pieces of him that he never intended to give? The schism was slowly healing, but Bernard felt the fractures within himself deepening. He worried constantly that pride might creep into his heart, that influence might corrupt his intentions, that the world might draw him away from the simplicity he loved. And yet, each time he knelt in prayer, a quiet assurance rose within him, that grace would not abandon him even in exhaustion. As this chapter settles into silence, Bernard returns once again to Clairvaux. The monks gather around him, relieved to have him home, even for a little while. The valley is peaceful, the psalms echo softly through the cloister, and night descends gently over the fields. But Bernard knows this peace is fragile. The world beyond the valley still trembles, and the next summons is already on the horizon. And so we leave him in that tender moment, breathing in the quiet, knowing it cannot last, wondering how much more his frail body and wounded spirit will be asked to endure in the name of unity. As Bernard rested briefly in the familiar stillness of Clairvaux, his body worn thin from the exhausting labor of healing a fractured church, Part 8 begins by gently gathering the lingering fragility of the previous chapter and carrying it inward toward the quiet place where Bernard's strength was truly born. For though Europe increasingly depended on him, though kings and councils sought his judgment, and though the world continued to draw him outward into storms he never desired, the deepest currents of Bernard's life flowed not through the public victories, but through the silent spaces known only to God. Clairvaux had become the center not only of a monastic renewal, but of a spiritual radiance whose source could not be measured by letters, judgments, or political reconciliations. Its true heart beat in the hidden chambers of prayer, where Bernard experienced the sweetness of divine intimacy, an intimacy that sustained him when the demands of the world threatened to consume him entirely. Every time Bernard returned from his long and punishing journeys, he went first not to rest, but to the chapel. The monks often saw him slip quietly inside, the heavy wool of his habit brushing against the stone floor as he lowered himself before the crucifix. There, without audience or spectacle, he poured out his exhaustion like water into cupped hands. All the sorrow he carried from mediating disputes, all the harsh words spoken against him, all the fears that clung to his heart, he surrendered them into the silence that had shaped him since childhood. These moments of prayer were not dramatic or mystical in outward appearance. Yet within them, something profound unfolded. Bernard found himself being held, soothed, and renewed by the God he longed for more than life itself. And slowly, through years of such hidden encounters, a deep mystical wisdom began to blossom within him. Bernard's mysticism was rooted not in visions or ecstasies, but in the tender, personal love between the soul and Christ. His sermons on the Song of Songs, composed gradually during these middle years, revealed a man whose heart had entered a mysterious union with divine love. In them he spoke of the soul as a bride, longing for the bridegroom, yearning to be embraced by a love that purifies, heals, and transforms. He wrote of the kiss of the Word, of the sweetness of grace, and of the deep rest found in surrender. These were not the writings of an intellectual seeking to impress with complexity. They were the words of a man who had tasted something of heaven's tenderness and could not help but express it in language that glowed like candlelight in the quiet of the night. His monks listened with wonder. Many said that Bernard's voice carried something like honey, soft, flowing, and filled with warmth. Others felt that his sermons opened their hearts as though removing a veil. Young monks struggling with temptation found in his words not condemnation, but an invitation to deeper intimacy with God. Older monks burdened by the weight of years felt consoled, reminded that holiness is not earned by strength, but received through love. Even those who did not fully understand his mystical descriptions sensed that Bernard was articulating something profoundly true about the human longing for God, a longing shaped by desire, vulnerability, and the courage to surrender. Central to Bernard's spirituality was his devotion to the Virgin Mary. In her, he saw not an unreachable ideal, but a tender mother whose life revealed the beauty of humility and receptivity to grace. When speaking of Mary, his tone softened even further, colored by affection and reverence. He called her the star of the sea, guiding souls through storms. He taught that the path to Christ passes gently through her maternal love. In times of conflict, he prayed to her with the trust of a child seeking shelter. And when he spoke of her to his monks, they felt their hearts drawn toward a deeper tenderness, learning from him that devotion to Mary was not a separate piety, but a natural flowering of love for Christ. These mystical depths sustained Bernard during the darkest nights of his interior struggles. Despite his growing influence, he carried secret wounds of self-doubt, fear of pride, memories of bitterness from those who opposed him, and the heavy sorrow of seeing the church torn by human frailty. His mystical prayer did not erase these burdens, but helped him carry them with grace. In moments of profound weariness, he felt Christ whispering strength into his heart, reminding him that he was not alone in his labor. These consolations did not always come dramatically. Sometimes they arrived as a quiet peace, settling over him in the hours before dawn, or as a sudden clarity during the chanting of psalms, or as a fleeting sweetness that lingered in his soul after receiving the Eucharist. As Bernard's inner life deepened, so did the esteem of those who met him. Travelers spoke of miracles attributed to him, healings, conversions, sudden moments of insight that transformed lives. Bernard himself insisted that such miracles, if true, belonged entirely to God, for he considered himself nothing more than a weak instrument. Yet people continued to come to Clairvaux seeking grace through his prayers. Some arrived carrying chronic illness, others came burdened by sorrow, and many arrived simply wanting to see the man whose presence seemed to stir faith wherever he walked. Bernard received them with humility, often praying over them with tears in his eyes. It was not the miracle that moved him, but the suffering of the person before him. Many left Clairvaux healed in body or soul, attributing the change to the holiness of its abbot. Yet even as the light of Bernard's mysticism grew brighter, the world outside grew more turbulent. Political alliances shifted, new disputes arose within the church, and regions once calmed by Bernard's counsel began to show signs of renewed unrest. The papal schism had been resolved, but unity remained fragile. And though Bernard longed to remain within the valley where contemplation softened every sorrow, new letters arrived asking him to intervene in matters of increasing gravity. Each request weighed heavily on him. Each journey away from Clairvaux felt like a small tearing of his heart. One evening, after receiving yet another summons, Bernard remained alone in the chapel long after the monks had gone to rest. The candles flickered gently, and the darkness pressed close. He felt both the sweetness of God's presence and the heaviness of the world's demands resting upon him. His prayer was simple, almost whispered. "Lord, give me strength to carry what you ask, and let me not forget that all is for love." In that moment, he sensed that the years ahead would demand even more of him, more than he had ever given, more than he believed himself capable of giving. Yet within that apprehension was also a quiet trust, a certainty that the one who called him would not abandon him to exhaustion or despair. As this chapter draws to a close, Bernard rises slowly from prayer, his body frail, yet his spirit luminous. The valley outside is wrapped in silence, the moon casting a pale glow over the fields. The monks sleep, unaware that their abbot stands on the threshold of a new chapter, one that will draw him farther into the world's turmoil than ever before. But for now, in this fragile moment between peace and burden, Bernard breathes in the sweetness of contemplation, knowing it is this hidden wellspring that will sustain him when the world once again demands the strength of a soul longing only for God. As Bernard stepped out of the chapel, in the dim blue light before dawn, carrying within him the lingering sweetness of contemplation, Part 9 begins by following the fragile peace that had wrapped around him in the closing moment of the previous chapter. Though his heart remained rooted in the quiet rhythms of Clairvaux, the world beyond the valley was stirring with a restlessness that would soon sweep him into one of the heaviest burdens he would ever be asked to bear. Europe, still tender from years of conflict and uncertainty, now faced the rising flames of a crisis that would set kingdoms in motion, ignite fervor in the hearts of the faithful, and move entire nations toward both hope and catastrophe. The murmurings began like distant thunder, uneasy reports from the east, urgent pleas from the Holy Land, small tremors that soon swelled into an unmistakable call. Christendom desired a new crusade. At first, the idea hovered faintly on the edges of political conversation, a desperate hope spoken in scattered letters and whispered in church halls. The territories once reclaimed by the First Crusade were weakening under renewed pressure. Christian pilgrims faced dangers along the routes they once traveled freely, and as fear grew that the sacred sites might be lost, voices began to rise, calling for unity, strength, and decisive action. Yet the leaders of Europe were divided, weary from recent conflicts, and hesitant to commit to a new campaign. Amid this uncertainty, the eyes of the Church turned not to kings or generals, but, unexpectedly, even painfully, to Bernard of Clairvaux. The summons came with startling clarity. Pope Eugene III, himself a Cistercian, and once a disciple formed under Bernard's guidance, wrote to him with both trust and urgency. The Pope asked Bernard to serve as the spiritual herald of a new crusade, to awaken the conscience of Europe, to stir the hearts of nobles and peasants alike, and to kindle the flame of Christian unity in a world threatened by fragmentation. Bernard read the letter with trembling hands. No task could have been further from the quiet life he cherished. He knew the gravity of such a mission, the anguish of war, the suffering it brought to families and lands. He understood that calling nations to such an undertaking was not merely a political act, but a spiritual decision with profound consequences. Bernard did not immediately accept. Instead, he went to prayer with a heaviness unlike any he had carried before. The chapel was silent as he knelt alone, wrestling with God in the fragile space between obedience and fear. He longed to remain in the valley, tending his monks, guiding souls gently toward God, living out his days in the contemplative stillness that had first claimed his heart. But obedience had defined his life, and so he prayed not for escape, but for the courage to accept whatever God asked. When clarity finally came, it did not arrive as triumph or excitement. It came as a quiet, sorrowful certainty. He must accept the burden. God was calling him to step once again into the world's turmoil, not as a warrior, but as a shepherd whose voice might unite a fracturing continent. Bernard's acceptance marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary campaigns of preaching Europe had ever witnessed. He began in Vézelay, where thousands gathered to hear him speak. The crowd was so large that no church could contain it. They assembled on the open hillside as the spring sun warmed the earth. Bernard, pale and thin from years of labor, stepped forward slowly, leaning heavily on his staff. Yet when he began to speak, something astonishing unfolded. His voice, gentle, resonant, woven with both sorrow and conviction, seemed to carry across the hillside with a spiritual force that pierced hearts. He spoke not with the fire of a warrior, but with the tenderness of a monk who had tasted the sweetness of God and now invited others to defend what was sacred. His words were filled with scripture, shaped by prayer, and rooted in a love that saw beyond politics and ambition. Contemporary accounts describe people weeping openly, falling to their knees, pressing forward to take the cross from Bernard's hands. Even King Louis VII of France knelt before him, pledging himself to the crusade with tears in his eyes. Knights tore strips from their garments to fashion makeshift crosses when the supply ran out. It seemed, in that moment, that Bernard's voice carried the breath of divine persuasion, awakening a unity and fervor that had not been seen in generations. Letters soon poured in from across Europe, echoing the movement that had begun that day. Bernard traveled tirelessly, preaching in city after city, Germany, Flanders, the Rhineland, each journey taxing his fragile health to the breaking point. Yet everywhere he went, people responded with overwhelming devotion, convinced they were witnessing God's call through Bernard's frail voice. During this time, miracles were attributed to him with increasing frequency. The sick were said to have risen healed after his prayers. The blind claimed to see as he passed. The lame walked again. Bernard himself denied any credit, insisting that God alone worked such wonders. But the stories spread rapidly, deepening the spiritual fire that already burned across the continent. Some who had doubted the crusade found themselves moved by these signs, interpreting them as heavenly approval. Others saw them as confirmation of Bernard's holiness. For Bernard, the miracles only intensified his humility, stirring in him a trembling awareness that God was acting in ways beyond his comprehension. But even amid these extraordinary moments, Bernard's heart remained divided. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him with immense force. He knew that calling nations to war was not the same as guiding monks in prayer. Lives would be lost. Families would be torn apart. The consequences of his preaching would reach far beyond anything he had previously undertaken. At night, when he finally lay on the thin straw mat of whatever guest house sheltered him, doubt flooded him with quiet intensity. Was he doing the right thing? Could he trust that this call truly came from God? Could his frail voice bear the responsibility of carrying the hopes of nations? Yet each time these questions rose, Bernard returned to prayer, to the stillness that had always been his refuge, and in that stillness he felt the same quiet assurance that had guided him through his earlier missions. "Do not be afraid. My grace is sufficient." And so he continued, step by step, town by town, country by country, until the crusade had gathered momentum that would soon sweep across Europe like a great wind. As this chapter draws toward its quiet closing moment, Bernard stands once again on a hillside at dusk, exhausted from preaching to yet another vast crowd. The sun sets, casting long shadows across the field where thousands still linger, holding their newly accepted crosses close to their hearts. Bernard's body trembles from fatigue. His face is pale, his eyes heavy, but within them burns a sorrowful devotion shaped by obedience. He cannot know what will come next. He cannot foresee the trials, the failures, the haunting weight of guilt that will soon settle on his shoulders. For now, he feels only the fragile hope of a world newly stirred to action, hope mixed with fear, devotion mixed with doubt, all carried by the voice of a monk who longed only for silence, but found himself at the center of a storm. And as night enfolds him, Bernard wonders silently, will this great movement lead toward God's purpose, or will it awaken sorrows he cannot yet imagine? As the last echoes of Bernard's sermons faded from the hillsides of Europe, and thousands of men prepared to march under the sign of the cross he had placed upon their shoulders, Part 10 begins by gathering the quiet yet trembling question that closed the previous chapter. Whether the great movement he had awakened would lead toward God's purpose, or open the door to sorrows he could not yet imagine. For the crusade that Bernard had preached with trembling obedience soon left the realm of hope and entered the harsher world of reality, where human frailty, poor leadership, and the unpredictable brutality of war would combine to shape one of the most painful chapters of his life. Bernard had set the torch alight, but once the flame burned beyond his grasp, he could only watch, pray, and grieve as events unfolded far from the monastic valley he longed to return to. In the early months, reports filtered back to Europe, describing the Crusaders' departure with great enthusiasm. Families wept as they watched their sons and husbands walk away. Knights rode proudly beneath banners woven with the cross, and kings marched with solemn vows. Bernard received these reports with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He prayed constantly for their protection, asking God to guide their steps and sustain their purpose. Yet the faint tremor of uncertainty never left him. Though he had preached the crusade at the Pope's request and out of sincere love for the Church, he knew too well that even the purest intentions could be marred by human weakness once armies formed and ambitions stirred. The first troubling reports came quietly, like faint cracks in a structure built on hope. Delays, disagreements among leaders, poor coordination between the armies of France and Germany. Bernard tried to remain hopeful, urging patience and prayer, but a growing unease settled over him. Then came news of harsh winter weather that swallowed supply lines, of armies weakened by hunger before they even reached contested lands, and of encounters that turned swiftly into disastrous retreats. The German forces suffered heavily in Anatolia, losing thousands in brutal ambushes and treacherous mountain terrain. The French army, though led by King Louis VII, fared little better, struggling with starvation, disease, and disorganization. As letters reached Bernard describing the unfolding calamity, each line pierced him like a thorn. He felt helpless, bound to the consequences of a movement he had helped inspire, but could no longer influence. The worst news came when the Crusaders reached the Holy Land and launched a misguided assault on Damascus. Bernard had believed, earnestly, prayerfully, that God would guide the Crusaders if only they embarked with purity of intent. But the siege quickly became a tragic miscalculation. Political rivalries among local leaders, combined with poor strategy and mistrust between the invading armies, led to a humiliating retreat after only a few days. What had begun as a hopeful effort to reclaim sacred ground collapsed into a bitter and demoralizing failure. Word of the disaster spread quickly across Europe, carried by weary survivors returning home with anger, confusion, and grief heavy on their lips. And soon, all that anger turned toward Bernard. Never in his life had Bernard experienced such intense public blame. People who had once wept at his preaching now accused him of deceiving them, of stirring a movement that led only to death and loss. Mothers who had sent their sons with trembling hope wrote letters of sorrow that cut him to the heart. Knights who had taken the cross from his hands returned in bitterness, believing that he had promised them God's favor and delivered them into ruin. Rumors circulated that Bernard had claimed miraculous approval for the crusade, and therefore any failure was proof of God's displeasure with him. Some clergy blamed his influence for overshadowing wiser counsel. Some nobles accused him of pursuing spiritual pride. Even people who admired him confessed their confusion. How could a man so holy have been the voice that led them into disaster? Bernard bore these accusations in silence, though inside his heart shattered. He had never claimed that victory would be ensured by human effort. He had never promised safety or triumph. All he had done was obey the Pope and preach with sincerity, trusting that God would guide the outcome. But now the weight of the Crusade's failure settled upon him like a crushing stone. In his letters, he expressed his grief with painful honesty. He apologized repeatedly, not for having acted wrongly, but for having been the instrument of a movement that had ended in suffering. He reminded people that God's ways are mysterious, that human sin and brokenness often distort even the holiest undertakings, and that divine providence is not measured by earthly victories. Yet these words brought him little comfort. The sorrow within him ran too deep. His physical health, already fragile, began to decline sharply under the strain. He experienced bouts of intense fever, crippling stomach pain, and periods of emotional exhaustion so profound that he could barely rise from his bed. Monks at Clairvaux watched helplessly as their abbot weakened, unable to shield him from the weight of the world's grief. Bernard, who had once walked tirelessly across Europe to heal divisions, now spent days lying in a darkened cell, praying for peace that remained out of reach. Even his greatest consolation, prayer, became a struggle at times, clouded by sorrow he could not dispel. He felt responsible for lives lost, for families broken, for the despair of those he had encouraged. In moments of deepest vulnerability, he wondered whether he had misunderstood God's call, whether his obedience had been flawed by human limitation. But slowly, through the gentle persistence of grace, Bernard found a measure of peace. Letters of compassion arrived from friends and fellow monks. Pope Eugene III wrote to comfort him, reminding him that the success or failure of human efforts does not rest on one man's shoulders. Many survivors of the crusade, humbled by their suffering, sought Bernard's counsel not with anger, but with repentance. Gradually, the atmosphere of blame softened, and people came to see the Crusade's failure not as the fault of one monk, but as the result of complex forces far beyond his control. Yet the memory of that sorrow never left Bernard. He carried it quietly for the rest of his life, a wound that shaped his humility and deepened his compassion. Even in later years, when speaking of the Crusade, he did so rarely and with a heaviness that made his brothers fall silent. For Bernard, the Crusade was not a triumph of preaching, but a testament to the fragility of human endeavors, even when guided by faith. As this chapter draws gently to its end, Bernard sits once more in the dim light of Clairvaux' chapel, weakened but still faithful. The world outside remains troubled, but within the soft glow of the candles, he rests his grief in the hands of the one who knows every burden. He has learned, painfully and profoundly, that obedience sometimes leads through valleys of sorrow, and that God's call doesn't shield a soul from suffering, but accompanies it through the darkest nights. And as he folds his trembling hands in prayer, a quiet question lingers once again in the silence around him. After such disappointment, how does a heart learn to hope again? As Bernard slowly regained enough strength to rise from his bed and return to the quiet routines of Clairvaux, Part 11 begins by gathering the tender ache left at the close of the previous chapter, that heavy question of how a heart learns to hope again after disappointment has carved its deepest valleys. The crusade had drained Bernard's body, shaken his spirit, and filled his heart with a sorrow he would carry like a hidden wound for the rest of his life. Yet even in this wounded state, the world did not release him. Letters continued to arrive daily, bearing news of conflict, requests for judgment, and pleas for guidance. Bishops sought his counsel. Abbots begged for his intervention. Families asked for prayers over broken relationships, disputes over land, questions of inheritance, and fears of spiritual ruin. The very influence that had burdened Bernard now intensified as Europe struggled to regain stability after the Crusade's catastrophic end. And so, though he longed to remain in the peace of Clairvaux, Bernard found himself called again and again to tend the wounds of others, even as he quietly nursed his own. The aging abbot moved more slowly now. His steps, once brisk and purposeful even in exhaustion, grew shorter and more deliberate. His once bright eyes often appeared shadowed by pain or fatigue, and the pallor of his face deepened with each passing season. Yet when he spoke to the monks, his voice retained its familiar tenderness, and the light of spiritual clarity still flickered behind the weariness. The young brothers at Clairvaux, who had joined the monastery in awe of his reputation, were often surprised to see how frail he truly was. Yet this frailty only deepened their reverence. For Bernard's holiness shone most brilliantly not in triumph, but in the quiet endurance of suffering, in the steadfast way he continued to love and serve even when his strength failed him. Despite his weakness, Bernard remained deeply present to his community. He rose before dawn to pray with the brothers whenever he could, even when the cold morning air sent sharp pains through his chest. During meals, he listened with fatherly affection to the scripture readings, often closing his eyes, as though letting the words wash over him like healing water. When disputes arose among the monks, as they inevitably did, Bernard spoke with gentle honesty, helping each brother see the other with compassion rather than judgment. At times, a young monk discouraged by his own failings would approach Bernard in private, trembling with shame. Bernard would take his hand, speak softly of God's patience, and remind him that weakness, when surrendered, becomes a doorway to grace. These small moments, repeated daily, gradually transformed Clairvaux into a place where suffering was met not with fear, but with tenderness. Yet Bernard's burdens extended far beyond the cloister. Among the most painful events of his later years was the death of his dear friend, Saint Malachy of Armagh, the beloved Irish bishop whose holiness had long comforted Bernard's weary heart. Malachy had traveled to Clairvaux with the hope of resting, perhaps even spending his last years among the monks he admired. But illness overtook him during the journey, and he died in Bernard's arms on the Feast of All Saints. Bernard felt the loss as a deep, personal blow. He later wrote the life of Saint Malachy with trembling affection, pouring onto the page his grief, his admiration, and the quiet consolation he found in Malachi's sanctity. That writing, filled with warmth and longing, revealed a tender side of Bernard rarely seen by the world, a heart capable of profound love and equally profound sorrow. Not long after, the losses struck even closer to home. His brothers, Galdrius, Gerard, and Andrew, who had followed him into monastic life decades earlier, began to fall ill one by one. Gerard, in particular, had been Bernard's closest companion, the brother he loved with a depth that surpassed ordinary affection. When Gerard fell gravely ill, Bernard spent long hours by his bedside, holding his hand, whispering prayers, and comforting him with memories of their youth. The day Gerard died, Bernard felt something within him break. In a sermon soon after, he spoke of his grief with raw honesty. "He was my right hand, the support of my weakness, the joy of my heart." Those who heard him wept, for they sensed that Bernard was mourning not only a brother, but a part of himself. In the midst of these personal losses, Bernard continued to carry the weight of public responsibility. Political conflicts flared across Europe, disputes between kings and princes, quarrels between bishops and local authorities, tensions that threatened the fragile peace of Christendom. Reluctantly, Bernard offered counsel, weary of conflict yet unwilling to abandon the Church in its hour of need. His letters grew softer as the years passed, infused more deeply with compassion. Where once he had written with firm conviction, now he wrote with the humility of age, urging patience, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Those who read his words sensed the tenderness of a man who had been shaped by sorrow, who understood the frailty of human nature, and who longed only for peace. Despite his declining strength, Bernard continued to write spiritual works that would shape Christian theology for centuries to come. His treatises on grace, humility, and love deepened in wisdom as his own experience of suffering sharpened his understanding of the human heart. His sermons on the Song of Songs blossomed into some of the most beautiful writings of the medieval world, shimmering with descriptions of divine love that seemed to flow not from intellect, but from a heart wholly surrendered. These writings were not the product of study, but the fruit of prayer. Long hours spent in silence, seeking consolation in the arms of God. And though he often felt inadequate, convinced his offerings were meager, the Church treasured them as luminous gifts. Bernard's health, however, continued to decline. Chronic stomach ailments plagued him with increasing severity, making even the simplest tasks painful. His body shook with fevers that drained his strength and blurred his vision. The monks urged him to rest, but he resisted gently, believing that his remaining days should be spent not in idleness, but in service. Only when he became too weak to stand did he finally allow his brothers to care for him. They guided him to a seat in the chapter house, where he continued to speak to them, his voice thin but filled with love. He often reminded them that suffering is not a sign of God's absence, but of his nearness, a truth he had come to know intimately. As this chapter settles softly toward its end, Bernard sits with his brothers in the fading light of evening. The air is cool, the valley quiet, and the shadows lengthen gently across the cloister walls. He feels the years weighing upon him, but he also feels an unexpected peace rising from within, a peace born not of victories, but of surrender. The losses he carried, the failures he endured, the conflicts he navigated all seem now to rest lightly in his hands. And as night approaches, he wonders quietly whether this peace is the first whisper of a deeper rest drawing near, a rest he has long desired but never dared to claim. And yet, even in that peace, a tender question lingers. How does one prepare the heart to let go of everything it has loved, and trust that the God who sustained it in sorrow will carry it gently into the final dawn? As Bernard sat in the dim chapter house and felt the first gentle stirrings of the peace that comes only after years of surrender, Part 12 begins by gathering the tender question that closed the last chapter. How does a heart prepare to let go of everything it has loved, trusting that the God who sustained it in sorrow will carry it gently into the final dawn? For though Bernard had carried sorrows before, though he had endured the exhaustion of leadership, the sting of public blame, and the burdens of a church fractured by competing wills, nothing tested the deepest fibers of his spirit more than the season of grief that now unfolded before him. These were the years when loss came not as a distant ripple on the horizon, but as a quiet knock upon the very door of his cell, taking from him those who had shaped his life, walked beside him, and reflected the gentleness of God's love in their companionship. Suffering no longer appeared as a theological idea or a remote possibility. It settled into the monastery like a cold mist, touching every corner, dimming the light of familiar faces, and asking Bernard to surrender over and over again the people who had anchored his heart. The loss of Gerard had already carved a deep hollow within him, and its ache did not fade with time. But soon, other brothers followed him into death. Guldrius, Peter, Andrew, each passing like a slow extinguishing of the lamps that had once illuminated Bernard's early journey. These were not monks he knew only in community. They were family, companions of his childhood, the very souls who had walked with him from the comforts of home into the austere wilderness of Cîteaux, and from there into the founding of Clairvaux. Their presence had been woven into his calling, a steadying warmth that helped him bear the weight of longing, of leadership, of exhaustion. Now, one by one, God asked him to let them go. The deaths came quietly, almost humbly, preceded by illness or weakened bodies worn thin from the rigors of monastic life. Bernard remained beside them whenever he could, holding their hands with the tenderness of a brother and the compassion of a father. He prayed softly over them, sometimes reciting psalms, other times simply whispering words of comfort. In these moments, he did not speak as the formidable abbot known across Europe, but as a fragile man who understood the loneliness of suffering. When a brother took his final breath, Bernard felt as though a small thread within his own heart snapped, leaving him both weakened and strangely more open to God. The community grieved, but the grief struck Bernard especially deeply, for each death reminded him of the fragility of love and the cost of giving one's heart freely. Yet it was not only his brothers by blood that he lost, it was also the friends whose holiness had strengthened his own. St. Malachi's death had been a profound wound, but its memory continued to soften Bernard's heart, reminding him that sanctity is not measured by longevity, but by love. Other friendships, long cherished, slowly faded as illness or age claimed their bearers. Bernard felt himself becoming increasingly alone, surrounded by monks whom he loved, but separated from many of the companions of his youth. This solitude was not the peaceful solitude of contemplation, but the solitude of age, the slow dawning realization that one's generation is passing, leaving behind an emptiness only God can fill. Yet even as these sorrows gathered around him, the grief did not harden Bernard's heart. Instead, it softened him in ways that startled even those who had known him for years. His letters from this period carry a gentler tone, shaped by suffering that had refined him like fire refines gold. He wrote of compassion, forgiveness, tenderness, and the need to see others through the eyes of mercy. He urged abbots to lead their communities with patience, reminding them that monks are not shaped by force, but by love. His earlier firmness remained, but now it was seasoned with a humility that had grown from the recognition of human frailty, his own and others. Bernard had become a man who understood that even zeal for God must yield to the gentleness of charity. His writings from these years reveal this new softness. In his sermon on the death of his brother Gerard, he spoke candidly about the way grief can break a heart open to God. "He was the joy of my life," he wrote, "yet God took him, and in taking him taught me that all earthly joys are temporary, given but for a moment to lead us toward the eternal joy that never fades." These words, fragile and profound, resonated deeply with those who heard or read them. They revealed Bernard not merely as a towering theologian or a powerful voice in the church, but as a man touched by the same sorrows that touch every human life. In the midst of this deepening sorrow, Bernard's own body began to decline in earnest. The illnesses that had troubled him for years now settled into him with a heaviness that no remedy could fully soothe. His stomach ailments grew more severe, making it difficult for him to eat. His joints stiffened, his strength waned, and fever became a frequent visitor. There were days when even walking from his cell to the chapel required the support of a brother's arm. Yet Bernard continued to pray with his monks, often leaning heavily on a staff as he stood to chant the psalms, his voice faint but steady. The brothers knew he endured these practices not out of obligation, but out of love, for prayer had become the breath of his soul. Even as his health declined, Bernard remained attentive to the needs of others. He continued writing letters of counsel, his words now permeated with an almost maternal tenderness. He mediated disputes with a gentler touch, urging reconciliation rather than victory. He offered comfort to those burdened by fear or guilt, reminding them that God's love is greater than any human failing. This season of life, marked by sorrow and weakness, became for Bernard a time of profound spiritual fruitfulness. His suffering did not diminish him. It refined him, revealing a purity of love that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for decades. The monks of Clairvaux, watching their beloved abbot grow weaker, felt a mixture of grief and awe. Bernard's presence, though frail, seemed to radiate a light that grew brighter as his body dimmed. They noticed how he lingered longer in prayer, how his voice softened into a whisper of love when he spoke of God, how his eyes filled with tears, not of pain alone, but of gratitude. It was as though he were already beginning to glimpse the horizon of eternity, sensing its warmth even as he remained tethered to the world by the threads of duty and affection. As this chapter draws toward its tender closing, Bernard sits by the window of his cell, looking out over the quiet valley that had shaped his life. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the fields where young monks now labor as he once did. A cool breeze carries the scent of earth and pine, mingling with the faint sound of distant chanting. Bernard closes his eyes, allowing the peace of the moment to settle into his weary bones. He thinks of his brothers, his friends, the sorrows he has carried, and the love that has sustained him. He knows the time for letting go draws nearer, yet he also knows that every loss has drawn him deeper into God, making space for a love more expansive than anything this world can hold. And as he opens his eyes again, a gentle question rises within him, no longer painful, but quietly hopeful. Could this deepening solitude be the final preparation for the embrace he has longed for all his life, the embrace that will gather every sorrow into eternal peace? As Bernard gazed out over the quiet valley from the window of his cell, feeling the soft pull of eternity begin to gather around the edges of his thoughts, Part 13 opens by carrying forward the hopeful question that closed the previous chapter: whether the deepening solitude encircling him might be God's final preparation for the embrace he had longed for since childhood. The valley lay peaceful beneath him, its fields brushed with the late afternoon light, and the gentle murmurs of the monastery drifted through the open doorway like distant memories made alive again. It was in these final years, when his body weakened and his companions dwindled, that Bernard's heart grew strangely stronger, steadier, and more serene. What had been shaped through decades of conflict, sorrow, labor, and obedience was now ripening into a quiet, luminous wisdom that flowed outward through his teachings, like the last rays of the sun setting over Clairvaux. Although his strength diminished day by day, Bernard continued to offer counsel to those who sought his guidance. He could no longer travel, for even a short journey exhausted him beyond recovery. But letters still came from every corner of Europe, from abbots pleading for insight, bishops asking for mediation, nobles seeking moral clarity, and friends simply longing for a word of comfort. Bernard responded as he always had, but his tone now carried a softness that seemed to come from another world. His words were less concerned with victory or resolution, and more attuned to mercy, surrender, and the patient unfolding of God's will. He taught that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of God within it, and that the soul matures not through triumphs, but through learning to rest in divine love even when surrounded by uncertainty. These final letters show Bernard's heart at its gentlest. He urged leaders to rule not with pride, but with humility, reminding them that authority is a gift meant for service. He counseled monks to practice compassion toward one another, insisting that the smallest acts of charity shine brighter before God than the grandest ascetic feats. He urged young abbots not to fear their weaknesses, telling them that God often works most powerfully through the frailest instruments. And to those burdened with guilt or shame, he offered reassurance that God's mercy is broader than any sin, deeper than any wound, and more tender than any human love. These teachings became a kind of spiritual testament, a final offering from a heart that had been refined through a lifetime of surrender. Within Clairvaux, Bernard's presence grew quieter but more radiant. He spoke less often in public, but when he did, every word mattered. The monks gathered around him with deep reverence, sensing that their beloved abbot was approaching the threshold of eternity. He preached fewer sermons, yet the ones he did offer shimmered with the clarity of a soul that sees both the fragility and the beauty of life with equal tenderness. In one of his final addresses, he reminded the brothers that the purpose of monastic life was not perfection, but love. Love expressed through patience, forgiveness, and the humble acceptance of one's limitations. He told them that a monk who knows he is weak is often closer to God than the one who feels strong, for humility opens the heart to grace like nothing else. These words settled into the monastery like seeds that would bloom long after his death. Despite his frailty, Bernard continued to write, and his last works reveal the depth of his mystical union with God. His reflections increasingly returned to themes of divine intimacy, the sweetness of surrender, and the longing of the soul for rest in its Creator. He wrote of heaven not as a distant reward, but as the natural fulfillment of a life lived in love, the completion of a journey already begun in the heart. When he spoke of death, there was no fear, only a quiet yearning, a gentle openness, as though he were already leaning toward the light beyond the veil. But Bernard did not withdraw entirely from the concerns of the Church. Even in his final months, conflicts still found their way to him. Political tensions simmered, Ecclesial disputes continued, and some sought to draw him once more into debates he no longer had the strength to endure. Bernard responded carefully, offering what guidance he could, but he no longer carried the burden of outcomes as heavily as before. His trust in God's providence had deepened to such an extent that he no longer felt compelled to fix everything. Instead, he encouraged others to act with courage and humility, reminding them that the Church is guided not by human effort alone, but by the unfailing presence of the Holy Spirit. Amid these responsibilities, Bernard found increasing solace in memory. He often sat quietly in the cloister or by the window, recalling moments from his youth, his early days at Citeaux, the founding of Clairvaux, and the faces of the brothers who had gone before him. These memories did not draw him into sadness. Rather, they wrapped his heart in a gentle gratitude for the ways God had shaped his life through both joy and sorrow. He saw clearly now how every conflict had humbled him, every friendship had strengthened him, every loss had softened him, and every burden had drawn him deeper into the embrace of divine love. What once felt like the weight of the world now appeared as a story of grace written slowly, tenderly, across the decades of his life. His monks noticed how often Bernard's eyes filled with tears during prayer, tears not of pain, but of longing and love. Sometimes, during the chanting of psalms, his voice would tremble, and he would pause, overwhelmed by the nearness of the God he had sought all his life. At other times he sat silently, hands folded, breathing slowly as though savoring the presence of the one who had never left him. These quiet moments became a source of inspiration for the younger monks, who saw in their abbot not a man defeated by age, but a soul approaching the fullness of union with God. As the seasons turned and Bernard's strength continued to diminish, the monks began to sense that the end was drawing near. They moved gently around him, anticipating his needs with love, guiding him when he walked, helping him rise from his bed, and sitting quietly beside him during long nights when sleep eluded him. Bernard accepted their care with humility and tenderness, grateful for the brothers who now supported him, as he had once supported them. He no longer fought the limitations of his body. Instead, he surrendered to them with the same trust that had guided his entire life. And so this chapter comes to rest with Bernard sitting once more in the fading light of evening, a soft breeze moving through the open window. His hands rest quietly in his lap, his breathing slow but steady. He knows the final journey is approaching, but he does not fear it. Instead, he feels a gentle expectation, a sense that the one he has loved so deeply is drawing near. The valley outside glows with the last light of day, and Bernard closes his eyes, resting in the peace that has finally begun to fill the hollow places within him. And in that tender silence, a final question rises, not with sorrow, but with quiet wonder. What will it be like when the veil lifts and the soul meets the love it has pursued through every storm, every loss, every breath of its earthly pilgrimage, as the soft question of what awaits beyond the veil settled gently into the fading light around him? Part 14 begins by lifting that tender wonder into the solemn, slow descent of Bernard's final days. The valley of Clairvaux, which had shaped nearly every breath of his adult life, now seemed to cradle him as a mother cradles her child, surrounding him with familiar scents of earth and pine, the quiet murmur of monks moving through the cloister, and the soft rustle of wind through the trees he had once helped plant with his own hands. Bernard had lived through storms of politics, crusades, schisms, and sorrows, yet in these last days, all such noise seemed to fall away like dry leaves, leaving only the essential truth he had carried since youth, that the human heart was made for God, and that all striving, all suffering, all longing ultimately led toward the stillness of divine embrace. His world grew smaller now, not through limitation, but through grace, narrowing into a space where love became the only language and surrender the only task. It was the summer of 1153, when Bernard's strength began to fade beyond recovery. His body, already weakened by decades of illness and exhaustion, now struggled even with the simplest motions. A lingering fever drained him, making his breaths short and his limbs heavy. When he tried to rise for prayer, the monks gently urged him to stay seated. When he attempted to walk to the chapel, his legs trembled beneath him. Soon he could make the journey only with assistance, leaning on the arms of brothers who supported him with wordless reverence. Eventually, even that became too much. Bernard surrendered slowly, reluctantly, to the reality that he could no longer join his community in the choir. But he listened. As the monks chanted, their voices floated through the open doorway of his cell, wrapping around him like a warm cloak. He closed his eyes, allowing the familiar psalms to settle into his heart, just as they had when he first entered Citeaux decades earlier. Despite the frailty of his body, Bernard's mind remained clear, and his heart beat with the same tenderness that had guided him through countless decisions, conflicts, and consolations. Visitors still arrived, some traveling long distances for one final word of counsel or blessing. Bernard welcomed them from his bed, his voice low but luminous. He spoke to discouraged abbots about patience, to troubled bishops about humility, to grieving parents about trust. He urged all to cling to Christ with simplicity and sincerity, to choose mercy over ambition, and to let their hearts be shaped by the slow work of grace. Some visitors wept as they left, sensing they had met not the formidable figure who had once influenced kings, but the gentle father whose sanctity shone brightest in weakness. In the monastery, the brothers moved with a hushed devotion. They sensed that a great light was preparing to leave them, and their steps grew softer, as though unwilling to disturb the sacred stillness settling over Clairvaux. They took turns sitting at Bernard's bedside, reading scripture to him, offering water when he was able to drink, adjusting his blanket when chills shook his frame. Bernard received their care with gratitude, often reaching out to clasp a hand or whisper a blessing. In his eyes, now softened by age and approaching eternity, they saw not fear but peace, the peace of a man who knew he had given everything God had asked, and now rested in the quiet trust that God would complete the work begun in him. As his final days approached, Bernard spoke often of love. He reminded his monks that love was the heart of their vocation. Not labor, not austerity, not brilliance, but love poured out quietly in community. He urged them to remain faithful to their simplicity, to care for the poor, to pray for the church, and to remember that every soul who sought God, even imperfectly, was a brother on the same narrow path. He spoke tenderly of humility, recalling how many times pride had tempted him in his youth, and how often God had rescued him through trials that stripped away certainty and left only trust. And he spoke of Mary, the mother whose quiet surrender had shaped his devotion for a lifetime. With tears in his eyes, he urged his monks to take her as their own mother, to rest in her gentleness, and to let her guide them toward her Son. The heat of late summer lay heavy over the valley, and Bernard's breathing grew more labored with each passing day. Nights became long stretches of wakefulness, broken by brief, fragile dreams. At times, he murmured prayers even in his sleep, whispering fragments of psalms or short invocations of Christ's name. As his body weakened further, he became increasingly silent, communicating more through soft glances and the faintest pressure of his hand when a brother sat beside him. The brothers tended to him with reverence, knowing that his suffering, even as it drained him, was a final offering, a last act of love that mirrored the surrender he had preached all his life. On the eve of his death, Bernard asked to receive the Eucharist. The community gathered quietly around his bed, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candles. The sacrament was brought to him with solemn care, resting in the hands of a young monk whose eyes shone with tears. Bernard's hands trembled as he lifted the host to his lips, and for a moment his face seemed to brighten with a serene joy. This was the God he had sought in solitude and in storms, the love he had preached to kings and peasants alike, the presence that had sustained him through illness, conflict, and exhaustion. Now, in his final hours, that same love approached him not in visions or miracles, but in the simple, humble form that had first drawn his young heart toward a life of surrender. After receiving the sacrament, Bernard closed his eyes and rested peacefully, his breaths shallow but steady. The monks prayed softly around him, chanting psalms that rose like incense, mingling grief with gratitude. Dawn broke gently, casting pale light over the valley. Birds began to stir. The soft wind rustled the leaves. And in that quiet moment, Bernard's breathing slowed, then paused. His face grew still, his body at rest. The monks fell silent, sensing that his soul had slipped into the embrace he had long awaited, the embrace of the God who had guided him through every trial, shaped him through every sorrow, and drawn him steadily towards holiness. Clairvaux held its breath, as though the valley itself understood the passing of a saint. The brothers knelt in prayer, some weeping openly, others gazing with awe at the peaceful expression on their abbot's face. The bells rang slowly, solemnly, carrying the news across the hills that the man who had shaped their community, and, in many ways, their century, had returned home to God. And as the chapter closes, a profound stillness settles over the monastery, echoing the quiet truth that even death cannot silence a life rooted in love. Yet in that stillness, a gentle thought stirs. How will the light of such a life continue to shine through the generations that follow, through hearts touched by his words, through souls he guided with tenderness and truth? As the bells of Clairvaux tolled slowly over the valley, announcing to the world that Bernard had slipped quietly into eternity, Part 15 begins by gathering the deep stillness that settled around the monastery. At the end of the previous chapter, the monks moved through the cloister in reverent silence, their hearts heavy with the ache of loss, yet strangely buoyed by the peace that seemed to linger in the very air Bernard had once breathed. His body lay in the chapel, where he had prayed so often, surrounded by candles whose soft glow reflected the serenity of his final moments. Outside, the world continued to turn. Fields rustled under the morning breeze, birds called to one another from the trees, and the distant river murmured its timeless song. Yet within Clairvaux, time felt momentarily suspended, as though creation itself paused to honor the passing of a soul who had poured himself out so completely in love, obedience, and service. News of Bernard's death spread swiftly across France, then across Europe, carried by monks, travelers, merchants, and clerics who had long admired him. Letters of mourning arrived in a steady stream, from abbots who had once sat at his feet for counsel, from bishops who had leaned upon his judgment, from nobles who had trusted in his fairness, and from ordinary people whose lives had been touched indirectly by his words or his prayers. Many wrote not only of sorrow, but of gratitude, crediting Bernard with restoring peace between rival factions, healing long-standing wounds within communities, and renewing spiritual fervor in countless hearts. Even those who had once opposed him, those who had criticized his sternness or questioned his involvement in disputes or blamed him for the failure of the crusade, now spoke of him with softened tones, acknowledging his sincerity, his humility, and the enduring grace that had shaped his life. In Rome, Pope Eugene III received the news with deep emotion. Bernard had been his teacher, his spiritual father, his guide through the burdens of the papacy. Eugene had once sat at Clairvaux as a humble monk, listening to Bernard's quiet teachings on humility and surrender, and now he felt the weight of loss keenly. He sent a letter to the monks of Clairvaux expressing his sorrow but also his profound admiration, calling Bernard a pillar of the church and a light for the nations, words that echoed the sentiments of many across Christendom. Although the canonization process in the 12th century did not resemble the meticulous procedures of later eras, it was clear almost immediately that Bernard's sanctity was recognized widely and deeply. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Pilgrims began to journey to Clairvaux to pray, to seek healing, to offer thanks. The memory of his holiness spread not as triumphal legend, but as a gentle whisper carried by the faithful. Stories of his tenderness with the sick, his wisdom in counsel, his courage in conflict, and his humility in every victory. Yet Bernard's greatest legacy did not lie in the political or ecclesial influence he had wielded, nor even in the miracles attributed to him after his death. His enduring gift to the Church was the treasure of his writings, a vast collection of sermons, letters, treatises, and meditations that continued to nourish souls long after his passing. His sermons on the Song of Songs, rich with imagery of divine love, became cherished guides for mystics, theologians, and ordinary believers seeking intimacy with God. His treatises on humility and grace shaped theological understanding for centuries, offering insights into the human heart that felt as fresh as the day he wrote them. His letters provided not only historical glimpses into the challenges of his time, but also timeless wisdom on compassion, leadership, and the delicate balance between zeal and gentleness. Generations of monks, scholars, and saints turned to Bernard's writings as to a wellspring of spiritual clarity. His emphasis on love as the heart of all Christian life influenced figures as diverse as Thomas Aquinas, who cited Bernard as an authority in his theological works, and Martin Luther, who admired the purity of Bernard's devotion even amid profound doctrinal differences. In the centuries that followed, Bernard would be called the mellifluous doctor, the honey-tongued doctor of the Church, a title given not for eloquence alone, but for the sweetness of a theology shaped entirely by love. Pope Pius VIII would declare him a doctor of the Church nearly 700 years later, affirming what countless generations had already sensed, that Bernard's voice, once heard only by monks in a valley, now resonated across nations and centuries with a gentle authority that outlived empires. Bernard's legacy also lived on through the Cistercian order he helped shape so profoundly. Clairvaux became a model for hundreds of daughter houses, its simplicity, purity, and devotion radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Monks who had sat under Bernard's guidance carried his teachings into new communities, forming monasteries that preserved not only the Cistercian way of life, but also the spiritual tenderness that had defined Clairvaux under his leadership. The liturgy, the rhythm of work and prayer, the emphasis on humility and charity. These elements endured long after Bernard's death, influencing monastic life across Europe and even beyond. Yet perhaps the most subtle and profound aspect of Bernard's legacy lies in the way he revealed holiness, not as perfection, but as surrender. His life, marked by frailty, exhaustion, conflict, and grief, showed the world that sanctity is not born from human strength, but from the relentless faithfulness of a soul that clings to God even in weakness. Bernard never sought to be a leader, never desired influence, never aimed to leave a monumental legacy. He only wanted to love God. And in loving so deeply, even when it led him into turmoil he never asked for, he demonstrated that God often chooses the most fragile instruments to carry out the most weighty tasks. His life became a living parable of the paradox St. Paul once described. When I am weak, then I am strong. As time passed, pilgrims continued to visit his tomb, kneeling before the simple stone that bore his name. Some came seeking healing, others seeking clarity, many seeking only the quiet inspiration of a saint whose journey mirrored their own struggles in ways they could not fully articulate. They prayed for the courage to endure suffering, for the humility to surrender their pride, for the strength to forgive, for the gentleness to love. And as they prayed, they often sensed Bernard's presence not as a distant historical figure, but as a companion on the pilgrimage of faith. A reminder that holiness is woven into the fabric of ordinary days, into each act of charity, each breath of prayer, each tear offered to God. And so, as this final chapter settles into its closing stillness, the valley of Clairvaux rests under the soft light of dawn, its fields touched by the memory of the man who once walked them with a heart full of longing. The bells that once tolled his passing now ring with the rhythm of new life, reminding the monks, and all who hear them, that the legacy of a saint does not end with death. It begins anew in every soul touched by his story, in every life shaped by his teachings, in every heart drawn closer to God through his witness. And in this quiet, reflective ending, one final question rises like a gentle echo, inviting the listener to carry it into the stillness of their own prayer. In a world still trembling with conflict, exhaustion, and longing, how might God be calling each of us, frail, imperfect, wounded as we are, to become instruments of peace, tenderness, and love, just as Bernard once was?